So I'm going to give a guest user access to my Office 365 tenant that I'm looking at right now. In particular, we'll give them access to a SharePoint site. But I thought I'd start out just by showing my Azure portal and a list of all my guest users. I've filtered my users just so I can see guest users only. So there are a couple of ways to give people guest access, and we have some older methods that are really revolve around SharePoint, and then we kind of have a newer method that Microsoft calls Azure B2B, or business to business, which is probably going to be the only way into the future. But for right now, we still do have an older way because SharePoint was doing this long before they kind of came up with this idea. But you can see over on the right-hand side of here, I have a source column, and under that source column I can see different places where people can be coming from. Now the idea behind giving people guest access is that we don't want to have to deal with passwords. We don't want to create users on our tenant, give them a password, tell people what their username and their password is. We just want to have people use their username and password from wherever they come from, and we want them to get in based on that. Microsoft has set up partnerships or federations with other entities. Certainly, you can probably figure out that they've set up federation between all of their Azure or Office 365 tenants. That's easy enough to do. They've also set up federation between their personal Microsoft structure and Azure. And in fact, you can see here we have external Azure Active Directory. These are other Azure tenants, Office 365 tenant users. Here's a user that has a personal Microsoft account. At the bottom, here's a Gmail user. They also have that set up, although you have to actually do some manual work to get that enabled. Here's a OTP, stands for one-time password. If someone doesn't fall into one of these, possibility. Yet another possibility is a newer possibility called direct federation, which we'll probably talk about in another video. So what I want to do is give another user access, and I want to specifically give them access to a SharePoint site. Now, I'm going to do it the older way, and then we'll do it a newer way. And you'll see it varies just slightly because once Microsoft creates a newer way, they don't actually get rid of the older way. It kind of sits around there, sometimes forever, sometimes for a long period. We end up having, that's how we end up having 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways to do the same thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch back to a SharePoint site here for a second, just so we can see what we want to give people access to. I have a SharePoint site called Project X. Here it is. And I want to give a user in an external tenant, a user called Sue, access to this. So how do I go about doing that? Well, a couple of ways. I could go back to my user section. I could add Sue as a new guest user and then give her access. But we can that would actually create a B2B user in the newer way. What I want to do is demonstrate the older way. So I'm going to go here to Project X, and I'm going to come into my settings for this site and go to Site Permissions. Under Site Permissions, I see my standard SharePoint sites, but I see a button here that's kind of calling me to click on it, Invite People. So I'm going to click on that, and it gives me an interesting choice. Add members to a group or share site only. Add members to a group would be a way to add users to an Office 365 group. That's not what I'm going to do. That's what I could do. That's a newer way to do things, and I would actually do it over in the Azure portal and not here. Interestingly enough, it doesn't really let me do that for guests here, even though it looks like it might. I'm going to invite people to this site only, and this is kind of the older way to do things. It's going to end up creating a B2B user, but the invite process works a little bit differently. So let me click on Share Site Only. And it tells me, well, you can add users to groups or security groups to give them access to a site. Note that this site is part of a group. If you add users here, they will be given access to the site, but not to other group resources. This is a very long-winded way of saying, hey, you're not really adding someone to a group, you're just giving them permission to this site, which is kind of the old school way to do things. So that's fine, that's what I want to do. I'm going to type in Sue's email address here. This is a Office 365 tenant. And when I click on it, it tells me, hey, Sue is outside of your organization. Okay, I knew that. Do we want to give her a little extra message here? That's fine. Welcome to the Project X site. And I'm going to click on the Add button. All right, let me close this stuff up. You can see site members. I see Sue has been added here. She's not part of this members group. She's been added directly to it. So let me close this up, and I'm going to pop back into my users, and I'm going to refresh this list. And sooner or later, Sue is going to show up here as an invited user, and then she's going to immediately get changed into one of these external Azure Active Directory users. So let's see how that happens. I'm now going to switch over to Sue's Outlook. So here is the invitation that Sue just got, and all invitations will be sent out as email. So I'm going to click on it. Now I can see right away that this is the old school invitation. New invitations look a little different. So we'll see those in just a little bit. Here it says go to Project X. Well, that's clear enough. I'm going to click on Project X. And then I see a little terms of use that I can edit as the inviter, not Sue, but whoever invited Sue. We can edit this to say whatever we want. By default, we get the default stuff here. I'll just click on Accept as Sue. It's going to eventually bring us to the Project X sites. Now I'm logged in as Sue. I see up in the top, if I click on this, I see Sue Jones. I can go to the documents here. So I'm basically a member of the Project X site. Close out of that. So now I'm going to go back to the Azure users for the tenant that Project X is inside of. And now we're going to see Sue in that group. So here we are back in the list of guests, and now I see Sue is in the group. She's basically redeemed her invitation, and she shows up here. Now this is a little different than the newer way I'm going to show you. The newer way is just to add someone as a guest. They'll show up here right away, only under source it will just say invited user. And then once they redeem their invitation, then it will show up as one of these. So we get to the same place, but it's a different process because once again, we had this older way to do things in SharePoint, and now we have a newer way. So we'll go through the newer way with a different user. So now I'm going to add another user, invite another user named Peter. Peter also belongs to this green cradle on Microsoft.com. When I invite Peter, I'm going to use a new method. There are several ways to get to start off this new method. I'm going to start from right here inside of the Azure portal. I'm going to create a new guest user. So let me start that out. I'll click on new guest user, and you notice right away I get a choice. Create user, invite user. I want to do an invite, that's what I'm going to do, but let's talk about what create user is. Create user is, again, another older way to do things. This would create a regular user in my tenant, give them a password, and that's the key. I don't want to give anybody a password. I don't want to deal with passwords, but that's what create user would do. Now, they will still be a guest user, which limits their abilities in some areas of things that they can do. But I don't want to do that. That's the old way to do things. I'd rather invite this person. That lets me only have an object for them created here without a password. They log on to their Azure tenant, and then they get access because I'm creating their name here as well. So let's create a guest called Peter. Peter exists in another tenant already. So that's his email address. Let's give his name in here. So I can send him a personal message, and You can notice I can even assign him to a group. Well, I want to do that. I want to put him in the Project X group because that's the group that has access to the Project X site. So here's Project X. I'll select that. Now I see one group selected, and that's all I really want to do. I'm going to click on Invite, and that's going to send an invite out to Peter. So now I actually see Peter listed as a guest. I'll refresh this, and you'll see that he is an invited user. This will stay this way until he redeems that invitation, which means he'll have to accept the terms of use that we saw last time. The invitation is going to look a little different, though, and his redemption process is going to be a little different as well. Let's take a look at what that looks like now. So here's Peter's Outlook. Peter is in this other Azure tenant. His invite looks like this. Notice it looks a little different. He's got a Get Started button instead of a button that says, go to the Project X site. I'm going to tell it to trust that stuff. So if I scroll down a little bit, I don't see anything else there. I just see Get Started, so let's do that. I'm going to click on Get Started. Here's where the difference comes in. Actually, it's going to come in a second. I still do see the terms of use. He'll accept that. But instead of getting redirected to the SharePoint site, which is what the old school invitation did, he gets pointed at the My Apps site. Now, I could have created that invitation to send him directly to that SharePoint site. I would have done that. I could do that with the PowerShell. But by default, it sends him to this area, which not the greatest. I do see groups over here. I don't see the SharePoint site. If I click on the groups, I'll see the groups that he belongs to. I see Project X. I can click on that. Inside of Project X, I see there's a SharePoint link there. If I click on that, sure enough, he gets to the Project X site. So it's a little different experience. He has to jump through a couple of extra hoops, but people can figure this out, and he does get to the same place that Sue got to. The difference between those two is that Peter has access to really anything that Project X group has access to, whereas Sue, she was not added to that group. She was just given direct permission to the SharePoint site, so she only has access to the SharePoint site. You can, choose which way you would like to do it. If I created this site and it created the Project X group along with the site, by default, it's really all it has access to is that SharePoint site. So they're essentially the same thing, but it's up to you if you want to do it one way or the other. Let's go back and see now how Fred's account looks in this Azure tenants list of users. So I've switched back into the list of users where the SharePoint site exists. I see Sue and Peter. Now they pretty much look the same. They're both guests. They're both external Azure Active Directory guests. Right? So their accounts here are really the same type of account at this point. They just went through the redemption process a little differently. Sue went through the older SharePoint method. Peter went through the newer business-to-business method, but they basically ended up in the same place. Their permissions are slightly different, though, because Peter belongs to the group, whereas Sue doesn't. She was just given direct access to the site. So I'm going to do this one last time for a user named Joan. And I'm going to try and start from this Project X again. And let me move this down a little bit so you can see the gear. I'm going to click on the settings here again and go to site permissions. I'm going to invite people again. And I'm going to tell, instead of sharing the site, I'm going to add members to a group. This is not the method I used last time. This is kind of a newer way that I'm trying it. It's not going to work, though. A little weird. So I'm going to tell it, well, I want to add members, and it's going to try and add members to that Project X group. So I'm going to do a new person here, a person named of Joan. So when I click on save, it says couldn't add. Okay? Add team members to this group. To add guests outside of your organization, go to Outlook. Well, yeah, for whatever reason, you cannot use this method from inside of SharePoint. They've tried to mangle the groups together here, and I guess they haven't really found a good way to do this yet. So we can do it the way I just did it before in the Azure portal. It's actually giving me a different option here. I can go to Outlook. Well, I'm logged on as an administrator right now of my tenant. If I go to Outlook, yes, that is another way that I can add people to this group. For some reason, I just can't do it from SharePoint yet. So that's fine. I'll click on Go to Outlook, and it's going to bring me to my administrator Outlook account. And it's actually going to bring me right into the groups area, which is fine. I'm going to actually click on all groups here, and I see the Project X group here. I'll click on that. I see the members. Peter is already a member, and I'm going to add another member. I'm going to add Joan. Click on Add Members here and start typing Joan's name. So it sees that this is an external user, so it's going to tell me, hey, I'm adding a guest to this group. They'll have limited access to the group resources. But yeah, guests have, again, certain things they cannot do. You know, they can't by default invite other people, for instance. But that's fine. I'll click on Add. And that's all I'm going to do. So now let's switch back over to see what Joan sees. So here's the invitation that Joan got. This is Joan's inbox. Again, it looks a little different than the other two we saw. So yet a different, another experience here when I added Joan to a group. But I do have a link to go to a SharePoint site. We'll try that one out. And again, it tells me I have to sign off and accept my terms of use. So that part's the same. So when I click on accept for that, Joan gets access to the Project X site just like the other users did. So going back to my Azure users, I'm going to see Joan once again listed like the others. Let's take a look. And here she is. So every one of these three that I've added ended up the same way. They're the same type of user. Two of them belong to that Project X group. One of them does not. All three of them have access to my Project X site, however, but the people who are members of the group could also get access to anything else that that group has access to. So there's an older way to do it with SharePoint, a newer way that Microsoft calls Azure Business to Business. In other videos, we'll talk about, we'll maybe show an example of the invitation redemption process from a Microsoft account or Google or one-time password, but it's pretty much the same thing. The one-time password's a little bit different because they get a little code that they have to type in, but the bottom line, all of them are the same kind of user. They don't have passwords. We just give them access to things. Their passwords are held in their other entities, and we've federated those, or Microsoft has federated those entities with Azure, except for the one-time password option. That's for users that don't have a federation choice. So hopefully in the future we won't have to use those as much as we are right now as Microsoft comes up with new ways to create this federated connection. So that's it for now. Remember to subscribe if you like this video, and we'll see you next time.